ตลอดทั้งสัปดาห์นี้นะครับไทยรัฐเจาะประเด็นได้นำเสนอเรื่องราวของการล่วงละเมิดทางเพศของบาทหลวงในศาสนาจักรคาทอลิกในไทยส่วนหนึ่งก็เป็นเพราะแรงกระตุ้นแล้วก็กระแสจากภาพยนตร์เจ้าของรางวัลออสการ์ในปีนี้นั่นก็คือภาพยนตร์เรื่องสปอทไลท์นะครับไทยรัฐเจาะประเด็นได้มีโอกาสได้พูดคุยกับคุณซาชาไฟเฟอร์นักข่าวหญิงซึ่งเป็นหนึ่งในสมาชิกของทีมสปอทไลท์ถึงสถานการณ์ปัจจุบันที่บอสตันรวมไปถึงทัศนคติของคนในสังคมต่อปัญหารวมไปถึงแนวทางในการแก้ไขไปติดตามบทสนทนาที่ได้มีการบันทึกเทปไว้ก่อนหน้านี้ครับ So 14 years now after the first article run on the Boston Globe, so it passed 14 years already, and the movie Spotlight came out and won the Oscar. So is there any spotlight effect on revitalize on the issue in Boston or other parts of America now?
Well, what we're finding is that many new victims are coming forward for the first time all over the country. Many victims have told us that this movie has made them feel liberated and empowered and kind of like a step in their healing process. And so there are victims who never came forward, and now they feel comfortable enough doing so because the movie has had national and international reach. And we feel like that's one of the wonderful things about this movie, is that it's made other people feel brave enough that they can come forward and they don't have to keep this secret anymore. And we hope that there'll be a support network waiting for them if and when they come forward.
Right. But at the beginning, as in the movie, that you have interviewed many victims, what will be the challenge for the victims to come out and share their experiences to the public or even to you?
Well, I think many of these victims felt very embarrassed and ashamed by what happened. So even though they were now adults, because primarily the people we spoke with were adult men who, when they were children or teenagers, had been sexually abused by priests. They had felt a lot of shame about that. And so even decades later, some of them are reluctant to come forward. They had never told their families. They had never told their spouses. So I think it's sort of a sense of, do they have the sense of courage to come forward and trust that their families and friends will be there to support them?
So what do you think, what helped them overcome that embarrassment to come out and then to tell the story?
I think there have been so many other people that have come forward that it has emboldened other people to feel like they can come forward. When we began interviewing victims in 2001, it was very difficult to find people comfortable enough and courageous enough to come forward. But when they did, that opened the floodgates for other victims to do the same. So sometimes it takes a few brave people to make other people feel confident to come forward. And that's the effect we've seen here in the United States.
So now Pope Francis has set up the special committee to taking care of this issue. But do you think that all the process are transparent enough?
I think the church has made some improvements. You know, there are now criminal background checks for people who work for the church and church employees. There is a law, there's a law in Massachusetts that if you work with children and you suspect that they are victims of abuse, you have to report that to the state. So that applies to doctors and teachers. It used to not apply to priests and church employees. That changed in 2002. Now they have to report suspected abuse also. So I think the church has taken steps to try to make abuse less likely to happen. But there are many people that believe there's still a lot more work to do, that there are still priests and church officials and bishops who were never held accountable. And so I think that the church has to stay vigilant, and I think the public has to hold the church accountable.
Is there any change on how people think about this issue or how the Catholic community in Boston think about issue in the past 14 years?
I think yes, although probably more of the change in some ways happened in the 1980s and 1990s. There had been so much deference to the church. You know, people really did not question its authority. They didn't ask it tough questions. And I think in the 80s and the 90s, we began to see that crumble. And I think since we published our stories 14 years ago, we've seen even more of that. That people, you know, I think they feel a lot of very justified anger to the church for having covered up what it did for so long. The church's whole goal was to avoid scandal, to avoid embarrassment, so it would pay victims money and make them sign confidential settlements and promise to remove priests from parishes, but then often simply transfer them to another parish. And people are rightly very outraged by that. And I think as a result, the church's moral authority has eroded quite a bit here in the United States.
When you first run this article on the Boston Globe, do you get any criticism from the public that your story going to ruin or destroy the church or destroy the Catholic, the victim that come to tell the truth and their story is the one who's going to destroy the church or Catholic? Do you get any some of that kind of feedback?
We worried about that. We wondered if there would be picketers or demonstrators or protesters outside the Globe on the first day we published. And we were surprised that there were not. What we found instead is that the public turned all its anger on the church and was very supportive of the Globe for having exposed this. And we think that the reason that there was that effect is that we were able to get access to all the church documents that showed decades of cover-up. It showed sympathy for accused priests, not sympathy for victims. It showed, heart-rending letters from parishioners saying, you have to remove this priest. This priest has abused my child. And then it said the priests were just transferred to other parishes where they often abused again. And I think when you can present documents like that, it makes your reporting bulletproof. And it makes it hard for readers to want to blame the messenger. And instead, they focus their anger on the right place, which was the Catholic Church.
So what do you want people to learn or understand about your story or your colleague's story or your victim's story when they watch the movie Spotlight?
I think two main things. I really want people to remember the importance of questioning authority. When there are powerful people or powerful institutions that are often sometimes beloved, like the church, people really are not comfortable asking tough questions. Or they just think that the organization can do no wrong. Or they may suspect there's some wrongdoing, but they're willing to look the other way. And I think this movie is a reminder of what happens when you look the other way. The other thing I hope is that it really reminds people of the importance of strong, responsible journalism and investigative reporting and what you lose if you lose that. In the United States, this is a terrible time for newspapers. They're very financially challenged, a lot of layoffs, a lot of downsizing, and a lot of newspapers cutting their investigative staff. And that's a real tragedy, I think. That is the one kind of reporting that should be preserved, probably above all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Pfeiffer, for joining us from Boston.
Great. Thank you for your time, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.